Hello. If you are listening to this chapter when the room has gone quiet, when the light has softened, and the outside world is beginning to withdraw, try to imagine something very simple. Not a pyramid, not a stone city, just a coastline. A fragile curve where land touches water, where the first humans learned to stay still long enough to call a place home. For most of recorded history, we have learned to look at maps as something stable. Continents sit still. Nations have borders. The oceans surround everything and serve as a distant edge separating one world from another. But that is the perspective of a very brief moment in time, a moment so young that compared to Earth's history, it is little more than a single breath. Around 20,000 years ago, when the world was still in the last ice age, the coastline we recognize today did not exist. Not merely slightly different, but a completely different world in shape. Those thin, gentle blue curves on modern maps, where land meets water, lay dozens, even hundreds of kilometers farther out than they do now. Sea level was about 120 to 130 meters lower than today. But that does not mean the ocean had pulled back. The water did not vanish. It simply changed places. Trillions of tons of water were locked inside immense ice sheets covering North America, Northern Europe, and much of Asia. Domes of ice kilometers thick, so heavy, they pressed the Earth's crust beneath them downward. The world then was not only colder, it was heavier, slower, and pinned down by ice. When scientists reconstruct maps from that period, what overwhelms the mind is not whether the continents look familiar or strange. Europe is still Europe. Asia is still Asia. The true shock lies in the spaces between them, places modern maps color deep blue, but which were land. Vast continental shelves, broad and flat and low, once linking coastlines together like gigantic natural bridges. There were rivers there, not small streams, but major river systems flowing across plains that now lie deep under the seafloor. There were freshwater marshes, coastal open woods, mudflats rich with life. And there were humans. Not as temporary visitors, but as familiar residents of that landscape. For prehistoric people, these places were not the margins. They were the center, where land and water met, where hunting and gathering overlapped, where movement and settlement blended. Ancient coasts not only offered abundant food, they also created natural corridors, routes where people could travel far without crossing the harshest environments. The sea was not a barrier, it was a guide, but precisely because those lands were low, flat, and close to sea level, they were also the most fragile. A slight warming, a few centuries in which ice melted faster than usual. That was enough for the entire landscape to begin changing in a way that could not be reversed. When sea level rose, it did not arrive like one great wave that swept everything away in a single day. It came more slowly, more quietly, like a step-by-step intrusion, a salty channel pushing farther inland each year, a marsh staying flooded longer after the rainy season, an old hunting ground becoming slick, then unreachable. And then within a few generations, what had been dry land became shoreline. What had been shoreline became seafloor. Those lands, once vast, once sustaining people for thousands of years, gradually slipped out of sight. And with them, the fragile traces of human life disappeared as well. There were no stone walls to collapse, no temples to be buried, only wood-bone plant fibers and oral memory, none of it designed to survive underwater. That is why modern history rarely mentions these places. Not because they were unimportant, not because humans never lived there, but because they vanished too completely submerged, not only from the Earth's surface, but from our methods of access. beyond the reach of traditional archaeology's shovel, beyond the dry layers of soil where history is usually found. When we speak of prehistory, much of what we know comes from places that were lucky enough to remain high caves, dry plateaus, valleys that were not flooded. But that is only a biased portion of the story, a story told by the lands the water did not take. The ancient coasts where humans may have lived the longest, in the greatest numbers, and with the deepest attachment, are silent. Not because they have nothing to say, but because the ocean has drawn a thick curtain over them, leaving us to infer their existence from faint map outlines and the cold language of geology. And from that silence, a larger question begins to take shape. Not a question about what was lost, but about what we never had the chance to remember. For hundreds of thousands of years before writing existed, humans lived mostly along the world's edges. Not because they didn't know how to move inland, but because edges are where life naturally concentrates. Along rivers, along lakes, and especially along coasts. There, food does not arrive in a single season, but in layered rhythms, the rise and fall of tides, the movement of shellfish clinging to rock seaweed, regenerating after storms, migratory birds returning on time. A system that can sustain people without farming as long as they understand it and remember. In those places, people did not have to gamble their lives every day. Protein came from the water. Minerals came from shells and seaweed. Fresh water came from estuaries. Roots and fruits came from the brackish wetlands farther inland. For prehistoric communities, coasts were not merely resource-rich, they were stable. And in a world where climate could be brutal, that stability was the condition that allowed humans to begin doing something crucial, staying long enough to learn from one another. Coastal climates were also gentler. The sea dampened extreme swings, keeping temperatures from rising too high in summer or dropping too low in winter. This did not only make human bodies more comfortable, it reduced survival risk. Fewer deaths from cold, less collapse from drought, less desperate movement. And when people are not always fleeing, they begin to observe, to remember to pass knowledge on. At these edges, movement became easier too. Coastlines were natural routes where people could travel far without pushing through dense rainforest, crossing dry deserts, or climbing dangerous mountains. Along the water's edge, groups encountered one another, not always in violent clashes, but in overlapping moments, harvesting the same sandbank, following the same fish run, taking shelter from storms at the same river mouth. Skills were exchanged there. Tools were learned. Stories were told again. Coasts, in that sense, were not only places to survive. They were places to connect connections between groups, between generations, between lived experience and collective memory. Before writing, these water-bound routes performed the work of a network quietly, without a center, but enduring. Yet coasts also carry a feature that deep inland lands do not, they never stand still. Unlike mountains or high plateaus, a shoreline is not a fixed boundary. It is a temporary cut between two states' land and water, always under the influence of forces larger than a human life: tides, currents, wind, and above all, climate. When climate is stable, that cut can hold its position for many generations. But when climate changes, when temperature rises by only a few degrees, when distant ice begins to melt beyond the horizon, that cut begins to move. Not with noise, not through dramatic events, but through changes so small they are easy to miss. 1 year, salt water pushes deeper into an estuary. One shellfish bed appears less often at low tide. One familiar path stays damp longer after rain. Within a single lifetime, those shifts can look like natural variation, but within a community's memory, they accumulate. And at a certain point, What was once an exception becomes the rule. A new shoreline forms. The old one vanishes. There is no marked moment, no final day, only a truth that slowly becomes visible. This is no longer a place to stay. That movement is irreversible. Once water takes low ground, it rarely retreats on human timescales. And so the coast, while nourishing long life, is also the first place forced to confront change. The very communities that depended on the sea's stability were the first communities compelled to move when conditions shifted. This is not one single tragedy, but a repeating pattern. Repeating in many places. Repeating across millennia. And each time it repeats, a portion of human memory is separated from the landscape that gave birth to it. The coast gave humans many things food routes connection, but it also reminded them of something fundamental: the world was not built to stand still. And any way of life that depends on its edges, no matter how refined, must accept change as part of existence. Around 12,000 years ago, the world entered a long warming phase. Not an instant shock, but a chain of successive transformations. Ice sheets began to retreat. Meltwater found its way back to the ocean. And sea level, which we often treat as unchanging, began to rise. From our perspective today, 120 meters sounds abstract. But if you place yourself inside a prehistoric coastal community, it did not unfold like a chart or a number. It unfolded as the gradual disappearance of familiar things: a sandbar no longer exposed at low tide, a salty channel pushing farther inland each year, a traditional hunting ground becoming too distant or too dangerous to reach. There was no moment when someone stood up and said, "The sea is rising." There were only small decisions repeated again and again, moving the camp higher, abandoning an old place, altering seasonal routes. And then within 1 or 2 generations, an entire land, once the center of life, lay underwater. What matters to understand is the process did not discriminate. It did not only drown less developed communities, it swept away every coastal form of life, regardless of scale or organization. Small hunter-gatherer groups, wide exchange networks, seasonal gathering grounds, ritual sites tied to natural cycles, all shared the same weakness: they lived on the edge. When modern archaeology formed as a discipline, it carried an unspoken assumption that history lies inland, that what matters will leave traces on plateaus, valleys, or dry ground that can be reached. And so, for more than a century, we dug into the earth in places that still exist. But that creates a paradox. We use what remains to infer the entire past, while most of the spaces humans once lived in the ancient coasts have been erased from the surface of the earth. Not destroyed by war or violent cataclysm, but by a quiet process that left almost no material memory behind. Today, as scientists use sonar shallow seismic surveys and high-resolution seafloor mapping, they begin to see faint lines beneath the ocean, ancient river systems, fossilized coastal wetlands, former shorelines lying dozens, even hundreds of kilometers from the present coast. But detection does not mean we can reconstruct the lost lives, because underwater archaeology is not merely difficult on a large scale, it is almost impossible. Current sediment, marine organisms, and time have blurred most of the fragile signs of human presence. Wood rots, leather decays, bones are swept away. What remains is often only stone, and stone rarely tells the full story of a living community. This creates a gap in our understanding. Not a small gap, but a blind zone stretching across 12,000 years of upheaval. We know a great deal about civilizations after sea levels stabilized, but about what happened before that, during the transition, We have only scattered fragments, and it is within that gap that the biggest questions begin to form. Not questions about advanced lost civilizations or vanished technology, but something simpler and far more profound. How did humans live in a world without a stable shoreline? How did they organize memory when places kept disappearing? How did they pass on survival experience when they could not rely on durable structures? Perhaps that is why many prehistoric societies placed more weight on memory than on material things, more on oral transmission than on building, more on ritual than on architecture. Because in a world where land could become sea within a few generations, the only thing you could truly carry with you was a story. When we say human history begins with agriculture, or civilization begins with cities, we are speaking about the history of what remains, not the history of all humans. Coastal communities' networks built around the sea may have existed for tens of thousands of years, learning to read wind tide and current, yet leaving behind traces that modern science struggles to recognize. That does not make them less important. It only makes them easier to forget. This chapter does not aim to offer a number. Not how many civilizations were lost, how many cities sank. It only aims to reset the starting point before we ask how much was lost. We must accept a foundational truth that most of human history took place in places we can no longer touch. The coastline we see today, familiar maps, harbors, coastal cities, is only the final state of a long process. Beneath that quiet water is not a mystical secret, but erased chapters of a deeply human story. And from here, as ice continues to melt, as water continues to rise, sometimes faster than we expect, the story will carry us toward more specific lands, places with names, with evidence, places that were once home. But before we go, let this quiet shoreline remain in your mind as a boundary that is not fixed, as a reminder that history is not only in what we find, but also in what has vanished forever. If the previous chapter spoke of a world with a different shoreline, this chapter speaks of the moment the world began to change shape. Not with an explosion, not with a single catastrophe stamped with a date, but through a sequence of silent transformations in which water, the most familiar thing of all, became the most powerful shaping force in human history. In the modern imagination, melting ice is often pictured as a slow, almost gentle process. Great blocks of ice breaking off in small pieces, falling into the sea in places far removed from human life. Sea level is imagined as a number rising on a chart centimeter by centimeter, spread evenly across centuries. A motion so slow that societies could adjust, build sea walls, relocate, adapt. A change that remains within the reach of intelligence and organization. But that picture is the product of a very short slice of human experience. It reflects only the last few hundred years, a period of relatively stable climate, when change has been slow enough to be recorded as data and regular enough to be forecast. When we look farther back into the geological record, the scene becomes entirely different. Data from ice cores, ancient corals, coastal sediments, and oxygen isotopes show that sea level in the past did not always rise along a smooth, straight line. Instead, it moved in jolts. Long stretches of relative stability, then sudden acceleration, then a pause again. An uneven rhythm reflecting instability within Earth's immense ice systems. There were periods rare but decisive when melting surpassed any familiar tempo. No longer gradual surface melt, but structural collapse, large ice masses breaking away from shelves, ice streams speeding up meltwater lakes, accumulating atop ice, and then releasing almost at once. These moments produced what science calls meltwater pulses, pulses of meltwater. The word pulse here does not mean an instant. It is not a day or a year. But on the timescale of human life, a few centuries is an intensely compressed span, short enough that change is no longer felt as evolution, but as a chain of successive losses. Short enough that the oldest people in a community could tell their grandchildren about lands that once existed, and those grandchildren could grow up in a world where those lands were already gone. During meltwater pulses, sea level could rise far faster than the long-term average. Not in harmless centimeters, but in meters accumulated within a few generations. And what matters is not the absolute number, but the speed, because speed determines the limits of human adaptation. A community can adjust when the shoreline retreats very slowly. They can shift camps seasonally. They can change harvesting grounds. But when water rises faster than culture can reorganize, familiar strategies begin to fail. Decisions that could once be postponed stay one more year. Wait and see what next season brings, become choices of life and death. What makes meltwater pulses especially dangerous is that they are not experienced as a single disaster. There is no clear moment of collapse, no final day to remember. Instead, there is a long, hazy feeling that the world is sliding away underfoot, but never fast enough to force everyone to leave immediately. That delay between recognition and action is precisely the space where memory begins to crack. For communities without writing, memory is held through repetition. When something happens often enough, in the same way it becomes knowledge. But meltwater pulses break that repetition. Each generation faces a different coastline. Each cycle of life is learned under altered conditions. And when parents' experience is no longer fully accurate for their children's world, the transmission of survival knowledge becomes uncertain. In that context, the disappearance of land is not only the loss of living space, it is the loss of the world's reliability. Natural markers that once helped people orient themselves. Sandbanks, estuaries, rock ridges are no longer there to confirm memory. And when the landscape no longer confirms the story being told, that story slowly changes form from practical instruction into compressed memory. From compressed memory into myth. Meltwater pulses, then, are not merely a geological concept. They are periods in which human history is forced forward at an abnormal speed, when environmental change moves faster than society's ability to name it, remember it, and adapt to it. When familiar worlds do not collapse in a single moment, but dissolve between generations, leaving behind the feeling that something once existed, vast, stable, and is now gone. And it is from these compressed spans of time that the deepest traces of loss begin to spread through humanity's collective memory. One of the most closely studied periods is Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurring around 14,600 years ago. Evidence from ancient corals, coastal sediments, and seafloor geomorphology suggests that during this phase, global sea level may have risen 15 to 20 meters within a few hundred years. Not everywhere experienced the same rise. Some regions rose faster, others slower due to subsidence or post-glacial uplift. But for people living on low coastal plains, those differences did not change the core experience the land was disappearing. What must be emphasized is this: there was no single day the water rose, no clean boundary between before and after. Only signs that became harder and harder to ignore: a river shifting its course, an estuary turning saltier, a sandbank that once emerged every season, now rarely appearing at all. These changes did not create instant panic, they produced doubt. And then over time, that doubt became a shared recognition that the landscape was moving in a new direction. For a prehistoric community, that recognition carried more weight than any number, because all of their survival knowledge depended on the world's repetition. When the fish arrive where birds nest, which mudflat is safe when the tide drops. When those rhythms began to slip even slightly, the entire memory system had to be rewritten. And rewriting memory without writing is a fragile process. Not every warming period produces a meltwater pulse. Most of the time, ice melts slowly enough that seas rise gradually. But it is these exceptions that leave the deepest mark in human history, because they shatter the foundational assumption that the world will continue to operate as it always has. They force people to act before they can fully understand what is happening. Another factor that makes meltwater pulses dangerous is their unevenness. Ice does not melt everywhere at once. Major ice masses can collapse, releasing sudden volumes of water into the ocean. Currents shift. Pressure on continental shelves fluctuates. In some regions, sea level may rise faster than the global average. Elsewhere, the combination of rising water and post-glacial subsidence can make the impact far more severe than any average line on a chart suggests. For coastal peoples, it is local difference that truly decides everything. Not how much global sea level rises, not planetary scale averages. What decides is a question specific and intimate: how much land their home loses within a single lifetime. In places with steep coasts where land rises quickly behind the shoreline, a meter of sea level rise may only reshape the coast, a rocky shelf exposed less often, a bay, cutting farther inward. Life can continue with minor adjustments. But on low plains where land stretches flat and close to sea level, that same meter means something entirely different. It is not only height, it is the depth of loss, pulling kilometers of land underwater. Places that were once lived on, hunted on, gathered on by season, all become shallow water, then open sea. And because sea level does not rise in one single surge but continues across generations, these changes are not experienced as one shock. They arrive as a chain of small decisions that feel temporary. Move the camp slightly higher after the rainy season. Avoid a sandbank because salt water pushes farther inland. Choose another migration route to follow the fish. Each decision is rational in its own context. But added up over time, they become a long-term retreat, unplanned, undeclared, yet irreversible. In the geological record, the Late Ice Age is sometimes described as a world melting, a phrase that suggests rising temperatures, retreating ice, spreading water. But for the people living through it, the feeling of melting did not come from cold or heat. It came from the gradual disappearance of familiar terrain. Not worse weather, but a world that became harder to recognize. Places that once served as anchors in community life, seasonal gathering grounds, familiar water landings, ritual points tied to natural cycles, were no longer there to confirm memory. One generation might remember they existed, the next only hears of them, and the generation after that grows up in a world where those places survive only as story, not experience. When terrain changes more slowly than biological adaptation, yet faster than cultural adaptation, collective memory begins to stretch and strain. Knowledge built on repetition, when the fish come, when the waters recede, when the sandbank appears, becomes less reliable. And when knowledge no longer guarantees safety, communities are forced to experiment. Experiment carries risk, and risk repeated produces loss. What is lost first is not people, but the continuity of living space. That space once functioned like an open book where memory was anchored in the landscape. When that book is torn, page by page, not in a day, but across many lives, reading the past becomes far harder. In that context, movement is not only a reaction to rising water, it becomes a strategy to preserve whatever memory remains, carry the story, carry the ritual, carry the names of places that no longer exist. But when those stories can no longer be checked against the landscape, they begin to change, not because people deliberately distort them, but because memory without a material anchor will drift. And here we see a subtle but crucial transition from living history into compressed memory, from direct experience into legend. Not to preserve perfect detail, but to preserve the feeling that there was once another world where people lived closer to the water, more bound to the land, and understood environmental rhythm in a way later generations could only imagine. That rupture is not a failure of human memory. It is the natural outcome of living in a world changing faster than any non-literate culture can hold. And that is why ancient coastlines where change was strongest are also where history was erased earliest and deepest. The Younger Dryas period, beginning after meltwater pulse 1A, makes the picture even more complex. This was an abrupt cold phase when temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped again for more than a millennium. For many communities, this may have created an illusion of stability. Ice returned, sea level rise slowed, the world seemed to pause. But when the Younger Dryas ended, warming accelerated again, and with it, the sea continued to rise. This interplay, rapid warming and short cold reversals, made human experience even more disorienting. There was no clear trend line to predict, no simple model to pass down. Each generation could only rely on the most recent memory, and that memory was often not enough to prepare for the larger changes ahead. This leads to a deep consequence. Communities living through meltwater pulses tend to move rather than build durable coastal structures. Not because they lack ability, but because long-term investment in sinking land is risk. Instead, they carry knowledge in the mind, in ritual, in story, things that can travel with people. From the present, it is easy to miss how continuous this process was. Not one migration, but many small waves unfolding over thousands of years. Each wave carried away a portion of memory tied to the old landscape. And when memory loses its material anchor, it gradually turns into legend, not to report the event precisely, but to preserve the feeling of loss. This is the real concrete background behind stories of rising waters, sinking lands, and beginnings again, not as vague metaphors, but as crystallized experience of living through rapid change. Meltwater pulses do not create myth. They create the conditions in which memory must find another form in order to survive. When the sea rises slowly, people can adapt step by step. When it rises quickly, adaptation becomes a life or death choice: leave early or stay one more generation. Carry what and leave what behind. Those decisions leave no clear trace in the geological record, but they shape the paths humans take across continents. And from those small decisions, the human map begins to change. Coastal routes are cut. Natural land bridges vanish. Communities once connected become separated not by conflict, but because water now stands between them. This chapter does not end with a single disaster. It ends with a recognition that there are moments in history when the speed of the world's change exceeds the speed of human remembering. And when that happens, what is lost first is not houses, but the continuity of memory. In the next chapter, we will step into a specific place, a land that existed long enough for people to call it home, and vanished completely enough that history almost forgot it. A land between England and Europe today, once a human bridge, and ultimately the seafloor, Doggerland. Between England and the European continent, today, lies a cold gray sea, often whipped by strong winds and short, restless waves. The North Sea appears like a natural void, a boundary that seems as though it has always existed, dividing land masses, shaping the map, and helping produce Europe's familiar historical stories. When you look at a modern map, it is very difficult to imagine that this space once had another form. But for most of the time humans have been present on Earth, that void was not a sea, it was land. Not a narrow strip or a fragile bridge, but a vast continuous expanse, a low flat plain opening between continental masses. Slow rivers winding through grassland and sparse woodland, carrying water toward directions that no longer exist today. Freshwater wetlands rich with life, shifting with the seasons, yet familiar to those who lived there. A landscape not overwhelming, not grand, yet stable enough for humans to attach themselves to it for a long time. For prehistoric people, this was not the in-between. It did not lie between two shores. It was the shore. It was where land opened out, where water had not yet claimed the ground, where people could walk across without realizing they were crossing a boundary that later generations would call sea. They hunted here. They raised seasonal camps. They followed herds, followed the rise and fall of water, followed the natural pathways carved by rivers and low terrain. There was no reason for them to think this land was temporary. There was no sign it would vanish. In the memory of many generations, the landscape was stable enough to become part of the world's order, where movement routes were handed down, where gathering places were remembered by name, where life was tied to specific terrain without needing to be written down. Today we call that land Doggerland. The name does not come from ancient legend. It is not preserved in any prehistoric language. It was coined by modern scientists based on a shallow area of the North Sea Dogger Bank as a provisional way of naming a world that no longer had anyone left to name it. It was not the true name of this place, but it is the only name we have. And that alone says a great deal, because a place that vast, that fed humans for thousands of years, that served as a central connector between groups, ultimately left behind no name in collective memory. Not because it was unimportant, but because when it disappeared, no one remained long enough to remember. No generation was born on that land itself with the chance to tell its story as a place. Doggerland was not conquered, not burned, not destroyed in a single cataclysm. It was withdrawn little by little until there was no longer enough land to call home. And when people left, they carried with them the memory of a world that was shrinking, not the memory of a world that had fully sunk. That memory over time dissolved into other stories, other migration routes, other new landscapes. So, when we look out across the North Sea today, what we see is not only water. We are looking into a silence in history, a place where there were once paths, where there was once ordinary daily life, where there once was no need for a name because it was too familiar. A world that did not vanish in a loud noise, but in a long quietness stretched across many generations. Around 12,000 years ago, Doggerland was not a narrow strip or a fragile bridge connecting two shores. It was a vast plain stretching from eastern England all the way to the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and farther north still. On the scale of prehistoric human life, this was not a middle zone, but a complete living space, wide enough to hold many communities, many routes of movement, many overlapping landscapes. Ancient river systems, now visible only as faint streaks in seismic data from the seafloor, once crossed this land with slow, steady rhythm. They carried more than water. They carried silt fish and natural pathways that humans could rely on for seasonal movement. Those rivers emptied into the ocean through estuaries whose positions today lie deep beneath the North Sea. Back then, an estuary was not an ending boundary, but a meeting place where fresh water met salt water, where the richest resources gathered. Doggerland's landscape was not one uniform barren stretch. It was diverse and flexible. There were open woods in higher areas where trees grew thick enough to break the wind, but not so dense as to block movement. There were open grasslands where large animals passed through seasonally, creating familiar hunting routes. There were freshwater wetlands rich with birds, fish, and plants changing in cycles, yet stable enough for humans to learn how to use them over the long term. It was a world not static, but predictable, and predictability is the foundation of every enduring form of survival. In that setting, human presence did not take the form of permanent landmarks. There were no great stone structures, no architecture meant to last thousands of years. People lived with the landscape rather than imposing themselves upon it. They set up camps by season, by food source, by water level. They left when necessary and returned when conditions were favorable. The traces they left, bone stone tools, fragments of wood plant fibers, were as fragile as the way of life itself. And so when Doggerland vanished, it did not leave behind easily recognizable ruins. There were no buried cities, no collapsed walls. What remained were only scattered fragments lying across the seafloor, waiting for an exceptionally accidental chance to be found. The first evidence of Doggerland did not come from deliberate excavations on land, but from fishing nets. In the 20th century, as fishing vessels worked deeper and farther across the North Sea, fishermen began hauling up things that did not belong to the modern marine world. Large bones from land animals, mammoth tusks, and teeth woolly rhinoceros remains. Rough stone tools worn by time, but unmistakably shaped by human hands. At first, these objects were treated as anomalies, things washed in from elsewhere, or simply random debris. But they appeared too often in recurring areas with features that could not be explained by modern marine processes. As the finds accumulated, and as geologists began comparing them with seafloor geomorphology data, a new realization formed. What was being pulled up was not displaced debris. It was the residue of a drowned landscape. Beneath the North Sea's cold water and fine sediment, scientists recognized the traces of buried ancient rivers, valleys filled in plains that had once lain open under an ice age sky. Stone tools were no longer isolated evidence. They became indicators of life, tied to river routes, higher ground places, where people had once stayed long enough to leave marks. What is striking is that Doggerland was not discovered in a single triumphant moment. It was assembled from scraps, a tooth hauled up in a fishing net, a seismic map revealing a riverbed, a sediment layer indicating an ancient marsh. Over time, those pieces began to fit together, not as a complete story, but as the outline of a lost world, and the way it was found reflects Doggerland's nature. It did not vanish in a single disaster that left a clear signature. It faded, gradually claimed, piece by piece, by water, until there was no longer enough land to sustain familiar life. When people left, they did not leave behind a final moment, only scattered traces waiting thousands of years to be connected again by science. Doggerland then is not only submerged land, it is a lesson in how history can disappear without needing to be destroyed. A world that was once real and vivid, yet because it left no durable structures, it slipped almost entirely out of human memory until fishing nets accidentally pulled it back into the light. Doggerland was not a civilization in the familiar sense. No cities, no stone architecture, no writing. But that does not make it less important. On the contrary, Doggerland represents the kind of world humans lived in for most of our existence. Flexible, adaptive, tied to natural rhythms, leaving behind few durable traces. For thousands of years, Doggerland was a center, not a margin. It was where groups moved med-exchange skills and experience. Ancient river routes made seasonal travel easier. Hunting grounds created gathering points. Wetlands offered steady food. Here, movement did not mean abandonment. It was a way of life. But Doggerland also contained the fatal weakness of every low plain. It depended entirely on sea level. As ice melted and seas rose, the land was not attacked from one direction. It was encircled. Water pressed in from the edges. Rivers became saltier. Freshwater marshes turned into tidal zones. Dry ground shrank not in a straight line, but in broken pieces. In this phase, Doggerland did not vanish immediately. It contracted. Across many generations, the immense plain became a network of peninsulas, low islands, and narrow strips of land. Communities had to adjust moving camps higher, changing migration routes, concentrating on remaining dry areas. Those decisions, reasonable in the short term, gradually altered the entire region's living structure. And then around 8,200 years ago, a major geological event occurred off the coast of Norway, an event not driven directly by melting ice, not tied to warming or cooling, but to the unstable structure of the seabed itself. Scientists call it the Storegga Slide, one of the largest underwater sediment collapses ever recorded on Earth. Along Norway's continental shelf, over thousands of years, thick layers of sediment had accumulated products of glaciation, meltwater, and materials swept out to sea. These layers did not remain permanently stable. They stacked on submerged slopes, forming a fragile system that could fail with only a small change in pressure or a tremor. When the Storegga Slide occurred, an enormous volume of sediment, stretching hundreds of kilometers, slid into the deep North Atlantic. This was not something people of that time could see from afar, but its consequences traveled fast through water. The sudden displacement pushed a massive volume of ocean, generating a tsunami that spread across the North Atlantic. Geological evidence suggests this tsunami reached the coasts of Norway and Scotland, leaving abnormal sediment layers, marine sand deposited far inland, mixed with freshwater deposits. These traces are not the work of ordinary storms or tides. They bear the signature of a high-energy event unfolding in a very short time. For Doggerland, what matters is this: the Storegga Slide was not the only cause, and it was not the beginning of disappearance. By that point, Doggerland had already shrunk significantly compared to earlier millennia. Long-term sea level rise had turned the once vast plain into a network of low islands, peninsulas, and narrow land strips. Communities had grown used to adjusting, adapting within an increasingly fragmented landscape. But precisely for that reason, they were more vulnerable. When land has already been broken apart, when familiar movement routes have narrowed, a sudden event, even a rare one, can carry effects far beyond what it would in a stable landscape. The Storegga tsunami, even if it did not need to be tall enough to obliterate everything at once, could still have been sufficient to erase the last lowest areas and surge deep into zones already close to sea level. For the communities living on Doggerland's low islands at the time, the experience may not have felt like an all-encompassing apocalypse. It may have registered as a sudden rupture within a sequence of changes they already knew. Ground that did not return to dryness after the water receded. A place once safe becoming uninhabitable. A decision forced faster than usual: stay and gamble, or leave immediately. What makes the Storegga Slide important in this story is not absolute destructive power, but its role as a breakpoint. For thousands of years, Doggerland had been losing land slowly through meltwater pulses and steady rise. That loss, though immense, unfolded slowly enough that people could adjust step by step. Storegga, if it happened as the evidence suggests, may have pushed that process over a threshold from adaptation to abandonment. After that event, the possibility of maintaining stable life on the remaining fragments of Doggerland became extremely limited. The last lowlands were no longer reliable enough to rebuild familiar cycles of living. Returning seasonally, a strategy that had worked for millennia, became risky. And when a place is no longer safe to return to, it leaves the human mental map. Notably, the Storegga slide left no clear memory in later legend. There is no great story of a North Sea tsunami passed down through generations. That suggests that for many communities, the event may have occurred when Doggerland was already nearly abandoned. It did not destroy a world still thriving. It closed a world already weakening. So Storegga should not be understood as a single catastrophe that erased Doggerland. It was the final chapter of a long process in which sea level rose, landscape shrank, and human life gradually withdrew, a last push strong enough to confirm what many generations had already sensed, that this land could no longer be home. And when the water steadied again, when the waves fell quiet, what remained was not ruins, but absence. A void where there had once been paths, where there had once been memory anchored to land. A void that thousands of years later, modern humans look at and assume has always been sea. The key point is this: the Storegga slide was not the only reason Doggerland disappeared. The land had already been weakened by long-term sea level rise, but the tsunami may have served as the closing force, drowning the final lowest areas and destroying any remaining chance of stability. If there was a moment when Doggerland ended, it was not a single day, but a short span held in community memory. One generation might remember that it was once possible to walk eastward across land. The next might remember only short boat crossings. And the generation after that grew up in a world where water stood firmly between Britain and the continent. What makes Doggerland especially important is not only that it existed, but that it nearly vanished from history altogether. There is no great legend attached to it, no epic, no ancient recorded name. When the sea rose and memory broke, Doggerland did not become myth. It was forgotten. Only when modern science began to look down into the seabed did Doggerland return not as legend, but as an archaeological warning that some world sustained humans for thousands of years. Yet because they left no durable monuments, they disappeared from collective memory. That the history we learn is the history of what remains, not the history of what may once have mattered most. Doggerland forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. Many of the most important parts of human history lie underwater. And those parts are not distant mysteries. They are landscapes very close, very familiar, simply no longer in the place we instinctively search. When water rises, people leave. But memory of place does not always follow. In Doggerland, that memory was cut so completely that it did not transform into a long story. It survives only as fragments, a stone tool pulled from a fishing net, an ancient river traced on a seismic map, a hypothesis assembled from cold data. And that is precisely why Doggerland becomes a key case study, not to prove that there was a lost civilization, but to show how vulnerable human history is to slow, irreversible change. It shows that land does not have to be lost in chaos to leave deep consequences. Sometimes all you need is enough time and enough water. In the next chapter, we will leave the North Sea and move southeast to a land even larger and more complex, where sea level rise cut an entire continent into thousands of islands. A world once continuous, now remembered only through faint outlines on the map, Sundaland. If Doggerland shows us a land that vanished between the familiar nations of Europe, then Sundaland opens a far larger vision, larger not only in space, but in the scale of transformation. Here, water does not merely erase a plain. It severs an entire subcontinent, turning one continuous world into the thousands of islands we now know as island Southeast Asia. Around 20,000 years ago, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today, Southeast Asia was not the fragmented picture of islands and straits that we are used to seeing. There were no thin ribbons of water slicing through the map. There was no concept of islands in the modern sense. Mainland Indochina, the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, Borneo. All of it was continuous, joined together on a vast, low, extended continental shelf that geologists call the Sunda Shelf. The outlines of today's map, so seemingly obvious and permanent, did not exist then. In many places, there were no clear, natural borders between land and water. Instead, there was an open space where ground sank gradually toward the horizon, where forests, swamps, and plains interwove through soft transitions. A world not divided by sharp boundary lines, but joined by the continuity of landscape. This was one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet, even by today's standards. A warm, humid, and stable climate over long spans of time created conditions for dense vegetation-layered ecosystems and the simultaneous presence of many large species. For prehistoric humans, Sundaland was not a harsh place to conquer. It was a nurturing space where abundance allowed people to live flexibly without forcing the environment into their own design. Running through that space were ancient river systems, today visible only as faint traces in the seafloor's landforms. But in the past, they were Sundaland's living axes. These rivers were not short and steep, like many rivers along modern islands. They were long, slow-moving, winding across broad plains, gathering tributaries from distant highlands, before finally reaching the ocean in places that now lie far beneath the surface. Those basins carried more than water. They carried silt nutrients, freshwater fish, and they created ecological corridors stretching hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers. Along the rivers, open woodland appeared, swamps formed, shallow seasonal lakes emerged and vanished again. Every element shifted in cycles, yet remained stable enough for humans to remember and anticipate. It was these river systems that formed natural corridors of movement. No roads were needed, no maps. Humans, animals, and plants spread along water. Large game followed the grasslands near the rivers. Humans followed the game. Seeds, pollen, and small organisms traveled with the current and expanded their range. Sundaland, in that sense, was a network of connection, not a collection of separated zones. In such a space movement did not mean leaving home behind. It was part of the order of life. Camp here during the rainy season. Move along the river as waters receded. Return to familiar points year after year. Those routes were not marked by milestones, but by collective memory where the water was shallow, where the ground was firm, where one could shelter safely when heavy rains lasted too long. What matters is this: in the world of Sundaland, water was not yet a barrier. It was a binding element. Rivers linked forest to plain. Swamps linked land to water. Estuaries opened into resource-rich zones where humans could combine terrestrial hunting with aquatic harvesting. There was no rigid division between land and sea, only different degrees of wetness within a single living space. And so when sea level began to rise after the Ice Age, what was threatened was not merely land area, it was the entire connective logic of Sundaland. As water entered low valleys, long river corridors were cut into segments. As plains flooded, first seasonal routes were disrupted. As estuaries widened into bays, familiar meeting points lost their old shapes. This change did not happen uniformly. In some places, the water rose quickly. In others, it was slower. But the common pattern was this: a space that had once been continuous began to break into pieces. and in that breaking Sundaland, gradually shifted from a seamless world into an archipelago, not through one single geological decision, but through thousands of years of accumulation. From where we stand today, it is difficult to imagine that the wide straits of the present were once river valleys, that what later became boat routes were once footpaths. Yet that difficulty of imagining is itself a sign of the magnitude of the change Sundaland underwent and the degree to which history was restructured by water. The landscape of Sundaland was not monotonous. It was a vivid composite of many overlapping worlds. In higher regions where ground rose enough to remain above floodwaters for most of the year, rainforest grew dense and deep. Canopies interlocked into a dark green vault that held moisture, held warmth, and slowed the rhythm of time. Light filtered down in thin streaks, the space quiet and humid and stable, a place where humans could shelter, hunt small game, and move along familiar paths. Lower down, where terrain began to open, the forest thinned. Trees were less dense, giving way to sunlit clearings, where grasses grew tall in the rainy season and dried when waters withdrew. These seasonal savanna zones were transitional spaces where large animals passed through, where hunting became more efficient, where visibility widened enough for humans to read tracks on the ground. These were the most animated places in the yearly rhythm, changing sharply between wet and dry seasons. Yet precisely that change created predictability. In the lowest regions, water became central. Freshwater swamps spread wide with no fixed borders. Shallow lakes formed and disappeared seasonally. Estuaries opened into broad, brackish zones where freshwater and saltwater mixed. These were extraordinarily productive ecosystems where life multiplied quickly and continuously. Freshwater fish moved with water levels. Shellfish clung to roots and mud flats. Aquatic plants grew fast, regenerating after each flooding cycle. In a world like this, food was not a rare thing to be hunted in desperation. It arrived from many directions at once. Terrestrial hunting was only one part. Fish from rivers and lakes provided a steady source of protein. Shellfish and freshwater snails could be gathered regularly. Aquatic plants offered tuber stems and leaves rich in energy. Migratory birds brought predictable cycles, returning in the right season to the right places. Each element had its own rhythm, and stacked together, they formed a system that could sustain humans year-round. The crucial point was not abundance in a single form, but the distribution of risk. When terrestrial hunting failed, water still yielded fish. When the dry season drained certain swamps, estuaries still functioned. When one area remained flooded too long, higher ground still offered refuge. Sundaland did not force humans to gamble everything on one source of life. It allowed flexibility, and flexibility is the foundation of long-term survival. The transitional ecosystems between land and water, places where boundaries were unclear, played a special role. They were not stable in a static sense, but they were stable in cycles. Humans learned to read very small signs, the smell of mud, as water receded the insects that appeared before the rainy season, the way the color of water changed when fish began to move. These details were not recorded in writing, but held in collective memory, transmitted through lived experience. In this space, humans did not need to master the environment. They lived with it. They did not build great dikes to hold water. They did not force forests back. They chose camp locations based on elevation, wind direction distance to fresh water. They moved when necessary, returned when conditions allowed. This way of life left very few durable traces, yet it created a long-term harmony between humans and landscape, That very harmony is what made Sundaland one of the richest resource regions humans ever inhabited, not because it was unconditionally generous, but because it responded proportionally to those who understood its rhythms. Yet because humans were deeply bound to those rhythms, when sea level began to rise and disrupt familiar cycles, the loss was not only land, it was the rupture of a living system refined over thousands of years. And as water pushed deeper into the lowest zones, where the transitional ecosystems had supported the densest communities, Sundaland began to lose not only area, but its ecological heart. In that context, humans did not need to build fixed centers to survive. Abundance made a flexible way of life possible, moving seasonally, following water, following food sources. What mattered most was the ability to remember landscape, knowing which river ran shallow in the dry season, which zones flooded in the rains, which routes were safe when water levels shifted. Memory, not architecture, was the primary survival tool. But just like Doggerland, Sundaland carried one fundamental vulnerability: low elevation. When the Ice Age ended and ice-melted sea level began to rise. At first, the change was slow enough for humans to adjust. But through meltwater pulses, water began to push farther inland. Low valleys flooded first. River basins were cut apart. Areas once continuous became peninsulas, then islands. The crucial difference with Sundaland lies in speed and scale. Here, when sea level rose by a few meters, it did not merely push coastlines back, it completely restructured living space. A river-based route became a strait. A familiar plain became a shallow bay. A network of communities once connected by land was split by salt water. For the humans living through this process, the experience was not the world sank in a single moment. It was gradual separation. Each generation witnessed a little more new water appearing between them and places once familiar. Distance grew, not only geographically, but in memory. Routes once passed down in speech no longer worked. Stories tied to old landscapes began losing their anchors. It is important to emphasize Sundaland was not a drowned civilization in the sense of cities or empires. There is no evidence of large stone architecture or centralized states at this time, but that does not reduce its significance. Sundaland represents a vast human world where millions of people may have lived, moved, and connected for tens of thousands of years, a world whose material traces were extraordinarily fragile in the face of water. As the sea rose, people withdrew to higher ground. Some groups moved northward into Indochina. Others remained on the surviving highlands, Sumatra, Borneo, Java, and gradually adapted to island life. This separation was not the result of one strategic decision, but the accumulated outcome of thousands of small choices made in many different local contexts. The formation of island Southeast Asia, then, is not only a geological event, it is an anthropological process. As water stood between communities, languages began to branch. Survival skills adapted to new conditions. Groups that once met regularly now met only in memory. And over time, those differences grew large enough to form distinct identities. Unlike Doggerland, Sundaland was not completely forgotten. Its traces remain in seafloor geomorphology, in genetic similarities between populations in water-edge survival traditions stretching across millennia. But its map is gone. There is no single story that tells of a subcontinent being cut into islands. Only scattered fragments of memory reflected across many different cultures. In many Southeast Asian traditions, water plays a dual role, both life-giver and separating force. Stories of land submerged, of ancestors traveling by boat, of an old world beneath the water, while not historical proof suggests that memory of great change was preserved, but in another form. not as maps, not as dates, but as a feeling that the world was once wider, more continuous. From the standpoint of the present, it is easy to treat islands as natural, isolated units. But Sundaland reminds us that this isolation is new. For most of human history, Southeast Asia was open space where walking across was normal, where water was simply one factor in the landscape, not the primary barrier. And when sea level finally rose high enough to shape the modern map, humans had already been there for a very long time. They did not arrive on islands as distant pioneers. They remained on the surviving pieces of a world that had been cut apart. That changes how we understand the origins of island communities, not as a late expansion, but as continuity under shrinking conditions. Sundaland, therefore, is not the story of a lost civilization. It is the story of a living space fractured, where history did not collapse in catastrophe, but was divided into smaller pieces, generation by generation. A world once continuous, now surviving only as faint outlines beneath the sea, and as hard to see connections between communities that seem far apart. In the next chapter, we will leave Southeast Asia and move north toward another land bridge that once joined continents. A place where the disappearance of land did not only separate space, but shaped the first path of humans into the Americas, Beringia. If Doggerland is a land forgotten between nations that already have names, and Sundaland is a world broken into islands, then Beringia tells a different kind of story, a story about a road. Not a stone-paved road or a marked trade route, but a vast empty corridor linking two continents. A road that existed long enough for humans to cross and disappeared so completely that it gave them no way to turn back. Between roughly 26,000 and 11,000 years ago, when sea levels were far lower than today, the land between Siberia and Alaska was not a strait. It was a cold, dry plain stretching for thousands of kilometers where Eurasia and the Americas touched. Scientists call that space Beringia, not as a destination, but as a temporary geographic state of the Earth. Beringia was not a narrow bridge to be crossed in a short journey. It was a world large enough to live in, wide enough for humans to stop, adapt, and let time settle into habit. Here, the cold did not resemble the relentless blizzards of the popular imagination of an ice region. Instead, it was a dry cold, carried steadily by wind across open space, where snowfall was lighter, and the ground in many seasons still lay exposed beneath thin, pale light. It was precisely the low precipitation that shaped Beringia's distinctive landscape, steppe tundra. This was a world of short grasses, scattered shrubs, and very little large forest. There were no dense walls of trees to block the view, no sheltered damp valleys. Instead, there were long horizons where the movement of herds could be recognized from far away, where tracks pressed into dry ground told the story of days before. In that landscape, life was not spectacular, but persistent. Grasses grew thick during the brief warm season, enough to feed great grazing herds. Bison, wild horses, mammoths moved along familiar routes, following seasonal food and water. They did not wander at random. They moved in recurring rhythms, and it was that rhythm that created the order of the Beringian world. Predators followed wolves, cave lions, and other carnivores not to dominate, but to balance. Their footprints layered over the footprints of prey, forming living maps across the ground. And humans with the ability to read tracks, read wind, read the smallest changes in the grass cover, entered that order without needing to break it. In Beringia, humans were not conquerors of the environment. They were part of a moving current. What matters is that Beringia was not completely covered by ice like the neighboring regions. while enormous ice sheets spread over North America and Northern Europe, pressing landscapes under thick, silent ice. Beringia existed as an ice-free zone, a rare ecological gap. Here the ground still breathed, grass still grew, animals still moved, and humans could remain long enough to call this place familiar. Beringia had seasons, but seasons here were not measured by comfort or harshness of temperature so much as by movement. The season when herds passed through, the season when water froze enough to cross rivers, the season when winds shifted, creating natural shelter behind ridgelines and low slopes. Those details, small, repeating, reliable, were the foundation on which humans could set camps, hunt, and pass on experience. There were shelters that required no building, a slope that blocked the wind, a shallow valley where snow did not accumulate too deeply, a bend in a river that held water longer during the dry season. Beringia was not rich in resources in the lush sense of Sundaland, but it was stable in its own way, and in a world surrounded by ice, that stability was a rare gift. That is why Beringia was not merely a road to pass through. It was a buffer of time, a place where humans could wait for herds to return, wait for ice to withdraw in one direction, wait for conditions to change in another. Here staying did not mean being trapped. It was a rational survival strategy in a world moving slowly yet uncertainly. To live in Beringia was to live with open space. Open space demanded sight memory and prediction. Those skills did not come from building structures, but from long observation. And over generations, they became part of the humans who lived here, not written down, not symbolized, but embedded deeply in the way they read the world. Beringia then was a gentle paradox of the Ice Age. A place cold yet livable, harsh yet not hostile. A world large enough for humans to remain and become themselves before continuing onward. And when sea levels rose, when this plain was cut in two and became a strait, what was lost was not only land, but a space in which humans once had time. For thousands of years, Beringia functioned as a buffer. Groups of people from Siberia moved in, paused, adapted, and continued. Not a single wave, but many small movements layered upon one another. Some groups may have lived for many generations in Beringia, forming social networks and knowledge systems suited to the cold, dry, open environment. In that sense, Beringia was a temporary homeland, not merely a gateway. But like every corridor tied to sea level, Beringia depended entirely on the low position of the ocean. When the Ice Age ended, ice melted, and sea levels began to rise. At first, this change was slow enough not to disrupt life. But during accelerated phases of melting water, advanced into low basins. Low valleys flooded first. Familiar routes narrowed. And then over a few thousand years, the vast plain was cut in two. The key point of the Beringia story is not that humans crossed into the Americas that is now clearly supported by genetics, archaeology, and material cultural similarities. The core lies in what happened afterward. When ice melted and sea levels rose, the road behind them did not close, with a gate did not collapse in a dramatic instant. It faded little by little until turning back was no longer a realistic possibility. There was no clear sign that this was the last time, no horizon-changing color, no boundary drawn between before and after. Only small changes initially easy to mistake as natural fluctuation, deeper water in a familiar place. Ice breaking earlier in a season. A passage once dry, now safe only for a few short weeks. These changes did not force an immediate decision, and precisely for that reason, they were dangerous. Over time, passages on foot became unreliable. crossings possible when water froze now existed only in unusually cold years. Low valleys were claimed by water first stretching routes or breaking them entirely. No one chose to remain on the American side. They simply lost the option of returning. This created a unique situation in human history. The groups who entered the Americas were not like explorers who intended to discover and then go back. They stepped into a new space with an implicit assumption that the world behind them would still exist. When that assumption collapsed, they became fully separated communities, not by conflict, not by ideology, but by geography, changing faster than human awareness. That isolation did not occur within one lifetime. It unfolded in the gap between generations. The oldest might remember that there had once been a wide, dry road where herds passed and humans could follow tracks. The next generation remembered harder crossings dependent on season and ice. And the next grew up in a world where water stood firmly between two continents, a world where the story of crossing could no longer be confirmed by experience. At that moment, history changed state. It ceased to be living memory and became narrated memory. And when narrated memory had no geographic anchor to compare against it, began to change form, not to become false, but to fit a new world where turning back no longer existed within practical imagination. That isolation carried deep consequences. Languages began to drift in their own directions. Tools adapted to new ecosystems, forests, plains, deserts, coastlines. Knowledge suited to the steppe tundra of Beringia gradually lost relevance. And most importantly, there was no reverse exchange. No stream of people returning with ideas, techniques, or refreshed memory. In later history, many civilizations were isolated by oceans, deserts, or mountains. But Beringia is different because the isolation happened after humans had already crossed, not before. It did not prevent the initial migration. It locked in its results. And once locked, the entire historical process of the Americas began branching into its own line, uninterrupted, uncorrected, unreflected against the old world. This is not a tragedy in the usual sense. There is no collapse of a fully formed society. But it is a point of no return in human history, a moment when geography quietly decided that from then on, communities on both sides would develop as different stories, even though they shared a starting point very close in time. When you look at the modern map, the Bering Strait appears like an obvious natural boundary, as if it had always been there. But in fact, it is a very new stitch on the body of the Earth. And that stitch severed not only land, but the human ability to turn memory back. The road did not disappear in a night. It disappeared slowly enough that no one noticed at first, and completely enough that no one could ever walk it again. And in that silence, the history of the Americas began not with a conquest, but with an irreversible separation. For many years, the great question of North American archaeology revolved around how humans entered this continent. The ice-free corridor between two massive ice sheets was once considered the main route. But growing evidence suggests that corridor opened late, perhaps after humans were already present farther south. Instead, an increasingly accepted possibility is the Pacific coastal route. Here the story returns to a familiar motif: the shoreline has vanished. During low sea levels, the northern Pacific coastline did not look like it does today. It was wider, with fewer cliffs, more shallow bays, tidal flats, and resource-rich ecological corridors. Humans could move along the water's edge, combining terrestrial hunting with marine gathering, a flexible strategy less dependent on frozen inland corridors. But this very route was among the first to be submerged when sea levels rose. If humans traveled along the coast into the Americas, then the evidence of them lies underwater. Temporary camp shellfish, harvesting sites, seasonal shelters all belong to ancient coastal zones now far below modern sea level. This explains why the earliest archaeological record in the Americas is sparse and fragmented, not because humans arrived late, but because the road they took disappeared. The isolation after Beringia sank did not arrive as a sudden shock. It seeped into human history quietly. There was no morning when communities woke up and realized they had been cut off from the old world. Only small changes repeated over many generations until distance became obvious and there was no longer any way to close it. Language was the first thing to begin drifting, without returning flows of people bringing older words and sounds back. Speech changed slowly. Vocabulary adapted to new landscapes. Words tied to cold grasslands and Beringian migrations lost meaning. New words emerged for dense forests, great rivers, long coastlines. No one decided to change language. It changed because there was no longer a reason to keep it the same. Tools followed a similar path. Techniques optimized for cold, dry, open environments were no longer ideal in the diverse ecosystems of the Americas. In forests, hunting tools had to be lighter and more flexible. On plains, herd-following strategies were revised. Along coasts, water-based skills became essential. Over time, tools did not merely change shape, they reflected a new way of thinking forged by environment. Survival strategies, therefore, stopped revolving around go forward or go back. They revolved around staying and understanding the new place. Camp building, time allocation, the transmission of experience to the next generation, all shifted. And when a strategy proved effective across many generations, it became the right way to live no longer, compared to any alternative. But the deepest consequence of this isolation is not found in language or tools. It lies in memory. Memory of the old road, the road that once joined two continents, could not be confirmed again through experience. No one could go back and walk it once more. No one could point to the landscape and say, "This is where we passed." And when memory can no longer be compared to reality, it begins to transform. At first, it is direct memory. The oldest could say their ancestors came from the north, from cold land, where great animals moved through. The next generation heard the story, but could no longer see corresponding traces in their living landscape. No wide open plain, no dry passage, only water forests, mountains, or deserts. The story did not disappear, it changed form. Over time, geographic memory became symbolic memory. The old road was no longer a specific place, but became where the ancestors came from. The north was no longer a direction one could travel, but a concept. Water became not just a barrier, but a boundary between worlds. This is not the failure of memory, it is memory's way of surviving after losing real anchors. With no comparison, no return history cannot correct itself. Small variations in retelling are not adjusted by new experience. They accumulate, they branch, and over time they produce different traditions, not contradictory, but independent. This made American history develop along a rare trajectory. No early reconnection, no reverse exchange to flatten differences. For thousands of years, communities in the Americas evolved culturally within a relatively closed space where each adaptation was tested directly against environment without external standards. When modern people look back, those differences are sometimes misunderstood as delay or separation. But from a long-term perspective, they are the logical result of an irreversible geographic cut. Not because these communities were less adaptive, but because they no longer had reference to the old world. Beringia, then, is not only a lost bridge, it is the last point where human memory could still travel with terrain. When it sank, history entered a new state one in which memory no longer anchored in land, but drifted in storytelling ritual and symbol. And when history drifts that way, it does not vanish. It changes its mode of existence. It is no longer a map one can walk, but origin stories in which humans try to preserve the feeling that there was once a road. And so Beringia does not become a grand myth in indigenous American memory. It is not told as a lost land because it no longer sits within lived experience. The memory of crossing dissolves into origin stories, legends of ancestors coming from the north, from water, from ice, images that are emotionally accurate but no longer contain a map. Here, water does not only separate land, it separates verifiable memory. And when memory loses geographic anchors, history shifts into another form, not distortion, but adaptation in order to endure. Beringia shows us another face of sea level rise. Not only the loss of places, but the closure of possibilities. Roads that once allowed migration, exchange, and return become barriers. Not loudly, not dramatically. Simply water takes the old place of land and stays. Looking at the modern map, the Bering Strait appears like a natural boundary, as if it has always been there. But that is an illusion of the present. For most of human history, this was open space, and its closing shaped not only a migration, but the entire history of two continents. In the next chapter, we will leave these lost land corridors and look at what remains. Not the roads that sank, but the places humans began building on higher ground ritual centers, gathering points where memory was held when water took the landscape away. Göbekli Tepe. After the roads disappeared, after Doggerland was swallowed, whole Sunderland was severed apart and Beringia closed behind them. Human history entered a very strange phase. Not a period of collapse, not a period of rebuilding in the familiar sense, but a period of the ones who remained. These communities were not survivors of a single catastrophe that happened in one moment and then ended. They were people of endurance, people who lived their entire lives inside a long transformation, slow but relentless. Over thousands of years, they watched lowlands retreat, waters advance, and landscapes that had once felt familiar gradually become unreliable. Not within one lifetime, but across many generations, long enough for change to become part of reality itself. They retreated upward, little by little, not out of a desire to seize new land, but because there was no other choice. The coastal plains that had once fed their ancestors grew brackish. The river mouths that had once been centers of life became deep bays. Seasonal routes held in memory by footsteps and repetition were cut off. Leaving did not look like a single grand migration. It looked more like a chain of small adjustments repeated again and again until the old world existed only in stories. They carried very little. Anything bulky, heavy, and bound tightly to place was left behind. But there was one thing they could not abandon: memory. Memory of places that had once existed but could no longer be seen. Memory of routes that had once been familiar but could no longer be walked. And memory of a world that had once been stable in its own way before water began rewriting the map. Those memories were not always clear. They did not exist as accurate maps or chronologically dated narratives. They existed as the feeling of a long loss, as the awareness that something had drifted away and could not be retrieved. And when memory could no longer be confirmed through everyday experience, it began to search for another form to hold on to. In that context, around 11,600 years ago in Upper Mesopotamia, where the land was higher, more stable, and beyond the direct reach of rising sea levels, something unprecedented appeared. Not a city, not an agricultural village, not a granary or a defensive fortress, but a place to remember. Here people did not gather in order to stay permanently, but to return in cycles. Not to produce, but to reaffirm. Not to defend territory, but to protect something far more fragile, the continuity of collective memory. In a world where land could disappear, they created a place where memory could stand still. Today we call that place Göbekli Tepe. That name is modern, like Doggerland or Sundaland. The people who built it did not call it that. But what they created makes one thing clear. A new awareness was forming, an awareness that there are things you cannot carry with you when you move, and therefore must be placed back into the ground. Not into just any ground, but into land high enough, durable enough, far enough from the water to outlast a single human life. Göbekli Tepe did not appear in a world that had never changed. It appeared after too much had already changed. And because of that, it does not resemble the familiar centers of power or permanent settlement of later history. It does not speak of the future. It looks toward the past, not to return, but to preserve what cannot be returned to. In that moment, human history crossed a new threshold, when roads were no longer reliable, when landscapes no longer carried memory. Humans began to do something unusual. They built memory out of stone, and from that point on, the post-water world was no longer remembered only by footsteps, but by places created for one purpose alone, not to disappear. What makes Göbekli Tepe so extraordinary is not only its age older than Stonehenge and the pyramids by thousands of years, but its position in the logic of history. Göbekli Tepe appears out of sequence. According to every model, history once took for granted monumental stone architecture should come later, after humans settle down, after agriculture produces surplus, after society becomes stratified enough to mobilize large-scale labor. But here that order is reversed. Göbekli Tepe appears before agriculture, before permanent villages, before granaries, before what we usually call the economic foundation of civilization. That forces us to stop and ask an uncomfortable question. If people had not yet farmed, had not yet lived permanently in one place, why were they raising stone? And what were they raising it for? The massive T-shaped stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe resemble nothing that came before. They are not houseposts. There is no roof, no domestic floor, no signs that people lived permanently around them. These pillars do not serve daily life. They do not shelter humans from cold or rain, and they do not preserve food. They stand there for another reason, a reason that cannot be measured by direct survival need. They stand there to be seen. Every pillar is placed with clear intention, facing inward toward a center, forming circles that are enclosed, yet not completely sealed. The space between pillars is not a place to live, but a place to stand, a place to gather, a place where humans turn to face one another and to face the carved figures on stone. Here, architecture does not protect the body, it organizes attention. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe is not a functional construction, but a cognitive structure. It does not make life easier in a material sense. It makes the world comprehensible after a long period of instability. The carved images are the key to understanding this. Predators with jaws open, birds with wings spread wide, coiling snakes, scorpions with sharp tails. There are no human figures in a personalized sense, no scenes of everyday life, no farming, no houses. These images do not tell a specific story. They do not describe a single event. They evoke an ecosystem. This is not a domesticated world. This is the world before humans became the center. A world in which humans lived among other species, pressured by them, dependent on them, and forced to survive within an order they could not fully control. The carvings are not there to celebrate human power, but to remember human position, small, fragile, and always watching. This becomes especially important when we place Göbekli Tepe in the post-Ice Age context. For thousands of years before humans had lived in expanded landscapes, coastal plains, grasslands, land-water transition zones. Life there was regulated by large natural rhythms, sea-level herd movement, migratory seasons. When seas rose and landscapes contracted, that order was disrupted, not through instant chaos, but through a gradual loss of predictability. Göbekli Tepe can be understood as an attempt to preserve memory of the older order, not through storytelling alone, but through images and space. The animals on the stone are not gods in the later sense. They are ecological memory signs of a world where life once moved according to laws larger than humans. And for that reason, Göbekli Tepe does not tell a linear story. It does not say, this happened then, that happened. It preserves a feeling that the world was once wider, more complex, and that humans once had to listen more than they controlled. It is the feeling of communities that had lived through too much change to believe the world was immutable. One detail deepens this interpretation. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Its stone circles were not abandoned for time to destroy. They were carefully filled in as if the structure had completed its role. This suggests Göbekli Tepe was not built to last forever in a purely material sense. It existed long enough for memory to be anchored. Then it was placed back into the earth, making room for a new phase of history. This is a very different logic from later architecture of power. Pyramids were built to defy time. Temples were built to proclaim the eternity of gods or states. Göbekli Tepe is different. It does not defy time. It works with time. It appears when needed and disappears when it is no longer needed. This suggests that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not thinking of a distant future in terms of accumulation and expansion. They were thinking about continuity, how to ensure that what had been lost would not vanish entirely from memory, how future generations born into a different landscape could still feel that there had once been a larger order and that humans were not the center of it. Here, architecture is not the result of power. It is a response to fragility. When land is no longer stable, when roads can no longer be returned to, when memory no longer clings to landscape, humans create a place not to live, but to remember together. And in that act, something crucial happens. Humans, for the first time, separate memory from dwelling. Before this memory lived with land. After Göbekli Tepe memory could be placed into stone, into ritual, into symbolic space. This is a quiet shift, but a decisive one, not for agriculture, but for civilization. Because from that moment on, humans did not only adapt to a changing world, they began to deliberately create fixed points inside a world that was no longer fixed. And when that happened, human history entered a new chapter, not a chapter of conquering nature, but a chapter of intentional remembering. Göbekli Tepe is not the beginning of the city. It is the beginning of humans recognizing that some things must be kept even when everything else can drift away. What matters is, this Göbekli Tepe was not built to last forever in a material sense. Its stone circles were deliberately filled in after a period of use. Not because they collapsed, not because they were abandoned, but as an intentional act. This shows that Göbekli Tepe was not a permanent center of power. It resembles a completed ritual, a memory placed into the ground, then covered. Why did humans begin doing this at that moment? A cautious view grounded in archaeology and climate context suggests that Göbekli Tepe emerged after the most intense phase of sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. when sea levels stabilized more, when higher lands became long-term refuge, when people began to realize that not everything could be carried while moving. For tens of thousands of years before, human memory did not need to be intentionally preserved. It existed naturally, bound tightly to landscape. People remembered because they walked the same land year after year. A bending river was memory. A high mound above floods was memory. A hunting ground where herds always returned at the end of the dry season was memory. There was no need to retell too much because the land itself reminded them. Memory then was not inside individual minds. It was out there in space. If your feet stepped into the right place, memory would arise on its own. What needed to be known was confirmed through repeated experience. What was wrong would be corrected by reality. Memory and terrain formed a continuous feedback loop, stable, slow, reliable. But when land disappeared, that feedback loop was severed. When coastal plains sank, when movement corridors were taken by water, when a road once walked became only cold, surface memory had nowhere to cling. Stories were still told, but there was nowhere to verify them. No one could point to the landscape and say here. No one could walk the old route again to refresh memory through experience. And when memory could not be confirmed, it began to tremble. Not because people forgot, but because memory was no longer used in the old way. What had once been remembered for travel became remembered only for retelling. And retelling is a more fragile form of existence. It depends on the voice on the teller, on whether the listener still finds meaning in the story. Over a few generations, geographic memory gradually lost sharpness, not through deliberate distortion, but through the absence of physical anchors. Old rivers could no longer be seen. Old plains could no longer be touched. Memory began to detach from maps and drift toward symbol. A route became the north. The mainland became the world before. Water became the boundary between what once was and what now is. This was an extremely fragile moment in human history. Not a moment of famine or war, but a moment when collective memory risked dissolving. Because memory no longer served daily survival, it could be ignored. And if ignored long enough, it would disappear. Göbekli Tepe can be understood as a deep cultural response to that danger, not a response of panic, not mere nostalgia, but the response of communities that realized, perhaps without abstract concepts, but through lived experience, that the old way humans remembered the world was no longer sufficient. Here they did not try to preserve memory by continuing to move. They could not. Nor did they preserve it by speech alone. Speech was not durable enough. Instead, they did something unprecedented. They gave memory a physical form. Göbekli Tepe does not preserve memory the way storytelling does. It preserves it through presence. The pillars stand there without explanation. They do not say what happened, but they say, stop. They force humans to return to the same place, repeat the same movements, see the same images, and through that memory does not need to be exact to remain alive. Here, memory no longer depends on individual recollection. It is externalized into space, into stone, into the way people stand circle and face the center. Even if later generations no longer know precisely why the place was built, they still feel this place matters. And as long as that feeling remains, memory has not vanished completely. What matters is that Göbekli Tepe does not try to reproduce the lost landscape. It does not carve rivers, plains, or roads. Instead, it preserves the order of the old world in symbolic form. Animals, predator-prey relationships, the presence of forces beyond control. It holds memory of a world where humans were not at the center, where survival depended on reading nature's rhythm correctly. In a world where landscape was no longer stable, Göbekli Tepe became the one fixed point. Not to live in, not to produce, but to remind people that there had once been an order larger than the recent changes, an order not created by humans, yet one that once allowed humans to exist. And in that moment, human history quietly changed direction. Memory no longer lived with land. Memory began to live with places built solely for remembering. Göbekli Tepe is not an attempt to cling to the past. It is the way humans learned to keep living when the past was no longer present in the landscape. A cultural response quiet but decisive. When land was no longer reliable, humans learned to anchor memory into something that does not move. And from that point on, history was no longer carried only by footsteps, but by stone ritual and repeated gathering across time. Here, humans did not try to recreate the old world. They did not rebuild the submerged plains. They did something else. They anchored memory in stone. Stone does not move. Stone is not carried away by water. Stone stands long enough for generations to return and say we were here. The builders of Göbekli Tepe left no writing, but they left spatial order, the way pillars face one another, the way circles open and close, the way people stand within and look toward the center. It is a way of storytelling without words, a way of preserving memory through shape, through movement, through repetition. More importantly, Göbekli Tepe shows that collective memory became a survival need no less than food or shelter. In a world that had witnessed too many geographic changes, humans needed fixed points not to live in, but to return to mentally. If Doggerland, Sundaland, and Beringia are stories about losing land, then Göbekli Tepe is a story about what remains when land is no longer reliable. Not maps, not routes, but ritual symbol and gathering. From this moment onward, human history begins to change direction. Not only because agriculture is about to appear, but because humans have learned something deeper. If landscapes can vanish, then memory needs another carrier. And in the world after the water, that carrier is stone. In the next chapter, we will look back on the entire journey, not to count how much land was lost, but to ask a harder question: when sea levels rise, what in humans must change, and what must not? Because human history is not written only by what collapses, but by what we choose to keep. When the land disappears, memory does not disappear with it. What vanishes first is the way memory once existed. In the ancient world, people did not remember because they tried to remember, but because the landscape did the work for them. A river bending through the land recalled an old route. A high patch of ground above floodwaters recalled a place of refuge. An open plain recalled where herds returned. Memory was confirmed by repeated footsteps. One only had to walk the right path, and memory would surface on its own. But when sea levels rose, when coastal plains were submerged, when corridors of movement were cut off, memory lost the thing that had once stabilized it most deeply: its physical anchor. Stories were still told, but they were no longer tethered to spaces one could step into. No one could return to the old route to check whether a story was accurate. No one could point to the landscape and say here, because that place had become water. And when memory could no longer be confirmed through direct experience, it began to drift, not vanish, but change state. In this new state, memory no longer served daily orientation or survival. It no longer guided routes. It no longer helped choose campsites or migration paths. Instead, it took on another role, preserving the meaning of what had been lost. Concrete details, names, directions, landforms gradually fell away, not because they were unimportant, but because they were no longer useful in a world where no one could verify them. Retaining them only made memory heavier, more prone to distortion with each retelling. What remained after this shedding was the emotional structure of memory. Not maps, but experience. Not numbers, but sensation. The sensation that water arrived faster than expected, that familiar ground no longer stayed still, that one had to leave without a clear destination. These were things that did not require maps to be passed on because they were tied directly to fear, to uncertainty, to the awareness that the world could change beyond human control. It was precisely in this gap between memory and landscape that myth emerged. Not as pure imagination, but as a compressed form of memory, durable enough to pass through many generations. Myth did not attempt to preserve every detail. It selected, it simplified. It transformed memory from where something once was into what once happened. In doing so, memory no longer depended on whether the listener had ever seen the landscape. It was enough that they understood the feeling that water could come, that land could be lost, that the world might no longer remain as it was. At that point, memory had fulfilled its function. This is why in flood stories we rarely see geographic precision. We do not see coastlines. We do not see specific river names. We do not see distances. Instead, we see recurring images, rising water chaos retreat, and a small number of survivors. This is not a poverty of imagination, but the result of a very long process of memory filtering. What could not be verified was discarded. What carried survival meaning was retained. For people living after the Ice Age, the most frightening thing was not water itself, but the loss of stability in the world. Myth preserves precisely that fear. It does not tell us how many meters the sea rose. It tells us that the world once stood still, and then it did not. It does not explain in scientific terms, because science did not yet exist. But it delivers a clear warning: do not assume the ground beneath your feet will always remain there. In this way, myth does not stand in opposition to historical memory. It is memory transformed in order to survive under new conditions. When land could no longer carry memory, story had to assume that role. And to do so across thousands of years, story had to change form from detail to symbol, from geography to experience, from maps to sensation. These stories do not allow people to return to the old world. But they do something else more quietly. They prepare the mind for loss that may happen again. And for that reason, even after landscapes vanish, even after roots are gone, memory of the water continues to flow, no longer anchored to land, but to collective human memory. What is striking is that these stories appear in many places across many cultures, separated by space and time. They differ in detail, but they share the same emotional structure. Before the water, the world exists in a familiar order. When the water arrives, that order collapses. After the water, only a few remain carrying memory of the old world. This repetition does not necessarily point to a single catastrophe, but reflects a shared human experience during the period of rapid sea level rise following the last ice age. For people of that time, floods were not rare events. What was rare was the speed of change. Accelerated phases of ice melt could raise sea levels fast enough for one generation to witness a dramatically different world than the one their parents had known. Grandparents once walked across a land. Grandchildren knew that place only as water. In collective memory, this was not a minor fluctuation, but an absolute transformation. For this reason, floods in myth are often told as a great deluge. Not because water literally covered the entire planet, but because the world of the storyteller was completely submerged. That world was not the Earth in an abstract global sense, but a lived domain where people hunted, gathered, buried their dead, and passed on memory. It was a space one could walk across, name, and confirm through experience. When that space vanished beneath water, the experience was total. There was no elsewhere to flee to, no familiar high ground to climb, no old route to return along. In collective memory, it felt as though the world had ended, even if geographically the disaster was regional. This mode of telling reflects a deeply human logic. Memory is measured by what touches daily life, not by global maps. When a community loses its entire familiar living space, memory has no reason to distinguish between regional and total. For them, the two are the same. Thus, the Great Flood in myth is not a scientific claim, but an emotional condensation of an experience of absolute loss. In this context, the recurring appearance of boats, rafts, or floating vessels becomes especially significant. Myths rarely say that humans escaped water through miracles. They do not fly into the sky. They do not command the waters to retreat. Instead, they remain on the water. They float. They drift. They wait. This is a deeply realistic detail reflecting survival memory among coastal and floodplain communities, where water had long been used as a space of movement, not merely as a threat. The boat in myth, therefore, is not a supernatural symbol. It is a compressed image of a survival strategy tested many times. When land was no longer reliable, when footsteps no longer provided certainty, water dangerous as it was still allowed movement. On water, people could preserve a fragment of order, carrying loved ones, tools, seeds of memory, not to conquer, but to retreat with structure. Notably, in many stories, the boat does not deliver people immediately into a better world. It merely keeps them alive. Time on the water is often prolonged, ambiguous, directionless. This is not accidental. It reflects a familiar experience during periods of rising seas. People did not know where they were going, only that they could not stay. The boat became a transitional space between a world that had vanished and one that had not yet formed. In collective memory, this phase is not recalled through maps or routes, but through waiting. Waiting for waters to recede, waiting for land to appear, waiting for a new anchor. And when that anchor finally emerges, the world after the flood is never identical to the world before. This explains why myths often describe a beginning after the flood, not because everything was morally cleansed, but because the new landscape forced people to live differently. Seen this way, the Great Flood is not a fantastical event, but the collective memory of a prolonged retreat before a changing world. The boat is not a miracle of salvation, but a symbol of the final capacity for adaptation when all other anchors have vanished. And because this memory was compressed into simple imagery, rising water, floating vessel, human survival, it became strong enough to be carried across thousands of years, across shifts in language landscape, and even how humans understood the world. Thus, when myths say that water covered everything, what they truly mean is this: there was a moment when for humans, there was nowhere left to stand. And in that moment, what remained was not land, but the ability to drift together, carrying the memory of a world that had sunk beneath the water. After the flood, the world in myth is often described as beginning again. Fewer people, simpler order, not because humans became more moral, but because old networks had dissolved. When gathering places, exchange routes, and corridors of movement disappeared, the post-flood world had to contract. Myth remembers this rupture by dividing time into two parts, before and after, not as a moral judgment, but as a memory marker. As communities were pushed to higher ground, they encountered one another. Groups that had once lived on separate planes now shared the same space. Each group carried its own story of water. When these stories were told side by side, they layered together. Over time, these layers fused into a narrative larger than any single experience. This is how a local memory gradually became a great flood in collective consciousness. In a world without writing, myth performs a very specific task. It preserves what must not be forgotten. Not technical detail, not precise chronology, but lesson. That land can disappear. That water can arrive faster than expected. That sometimes one must leave, and sometimes one must carry the memory of the old world in order to live in the new one. In this sense, myth does not oppose history. It is history compressed, so it can travel through long time across generations without maps, without writing, without means of verification. It sacrifices precision in order to preserve meaning. And for that reason, it endures. When flood stories are placed alongside Göbekli Tepe, something becomes clear. Both appear when the landscape is no longer stable enough to serve as a vessel for memory. Myth carries memory in storytelling, flexible and adaptive. Stone carries memory in space, fixed and requiring return. Two different paths driven by the same need to prevent loss from being forgotten. So, when we listen to flood myths, perhaps the right question is not whether they are true in a modern sense, but rather, what are they trying to preserve after land itself has disappeared? And the answer, repeated across cultures, is remarkably consistent: that there was once another world, that water took it away, and that memory of this, however compressed, however transformed, must not be allowed to drift away with the water. When this journey reaches its end, the question that remains sounds deceptively simple: how many civilizations did we lose? Yet it is precisely this simplicity that conceals a deeper misunderstanding. For the question assumes that what was lost can be counted, arranged, and measured within the same framework we use for stone-walled cities, clearly dated dynasties, and historical milestones preserved by writing. It assumes that only what leaves durable traces deserves to be recognized as a world that once existed. The reality is that most of what disappeared never existed in the form we commonly call civilization. Across 12,000 years of rising seas, the communities that were lost were not necessarily societies that built cities or left monumental architecture behind. Many lived through extreme flexibility, moving seasonally, erecting camps, and dismantling them again, following the rhythms of water, animal herds, and the lowland ecosystems around them. They did not need stone to assert their existence, because the landscape itself was their structure. These communities had social organization divisions of roles, rituals, and traditions passed down through generations. They possessed collective memory no less complex than that of later literate societies. But that memory was preserved through repetition of movement, walking the same routes, returning to the same seasonal gathering places. As long as the land remained, everything functioned steadily without the need for durable materials. When the land disappeared, the entire system unraveled without leaving a skeleton behind. Unlike an abandoned city where stone walls still stand to say people once lived here, mobile communities leave no easily recognizable markers. Camps do not fossilize. Migration routes do not imprint themselves into soil. Rituals held on open ground near water leave no foundations. When sea levels rose and submerged low-lying lands, not only did people retreat, but the very possibility of recording their existence vanished with them. This creates a profound gap in how we understand the past. Archaeology, no matter how sophisticated it becomes, still depends heavily on what remains. And what remains tends to favor fixed societies built from durable materials living at higher elevations. This does not mean those societies were more common in the past. It only means they were more fortunate in terms of preservation. For this reason, when we ask how many civilizations were lost, the answer cannot be a number. Not because we have not excavated deeply enough, but because counting itself is the wrong tool. The communities that vanished were not discrete units with clear borders, fixed names, or precise chronologies. They were living networks stretched across landscapes, changing with the seasons, tied to lands that today lie beneath tens of meters of water. It may be closer to the truth to say that we lost ways of living. Worlds where people did not need surplus accumulation to survive. Societies where memory did not need to be carved into stone because the land held it on their behalf. Survival systems that functioned well in a stable world, but were not designed to endure once the world itself began to move. And when those worlds disappeared, they left no message saying we were here. They left only faint traces, a stone tool caught in a fishing net, a story about water retold in a changed language, a recurring sensation across many myths that there was once a larger world, and then it was gone. For this reason, the question of how many may not be the most important one. What matters more is recognizing that most of human history did not unfold in places likely to endure within the archaeological record. It unfolded at the edges of land in low-lying regions, in spaces always at risk of vanishing. And when those spaces were taken by water, their histories were carried away as well, not because they were insignificant, but because they were bound too closely to a world that no longer stood still. So, when we ask how many, we are searching for a number for something that was never recorded. We can reconstruct ancient coastlines. We can measure how many meters the sea rose. We can identify continental shelves that were once exposed. But we cannot easily know how many communities lived there, how they were organized, or how rich their worlds were before the water arrived. What we do know is this: for most of human history, people lived close to water, along rivers, along lakes, along coastlines, not because they were naive about danger, but because life there was richer and more stable. When sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today, these margins expanded into vast plains, Doggerland, Sundaland, Beringia, and many other places without names. If humans lived along coasts for tens of thousands of years, then when the seas rose, the first places to be lost were also the places where people were most concentrated. And that loss did not occur in a single moment. It was a long retreat across generations. There was no doomsday, no sharp boundary between what remained and what was gone. Only small decisions repeated over time, moving camps higher, abandoning a hunting ground, giving up a familiar route. Gradually, those decisions accumulated into the disappearance of an entire lived world. When the water finally rose high enough, no one remained who could remember exactly what that world had once been like. Here, the concept of civilization reveals its deepest limitations. We habitually use the term to describe societies that leave durable traces: stone walls, temples, writing, administrative systems visible in archaeological layers. These criteria work well for describing a certain phase of history when humans began fixing life in place and materializing memory. But applied backward across most of humanity's existence, they become far too narrow. Thousands of years before stone was stacked into architecture and writing was carved into surfaces, humans lived within social systems no less complex, only complex in a different way. Their complexity lay not in monuments, but in reading landscapes, remembering ecological rhythms, and adjusting collective behavior to subtle environmental shifts. They knew when waters would rise seasonally, when animal herds would return, when to leave, and when to stay. Their knowledge was not stored in archives, but in coordination between people, between individual memory and collective memory. These ways of living were inseparable from the landscape. A route was not merely a path, but an ecological calendar. A gathering place was not just physical space, but a site where memory was renewed with each return. In such a world, memory did not need to be written down because the land remembered on humanity's behalf. As long as the landscape remained stable, the entire social system could continue without durable materials. Yet that same intimacy became a fatal vulnerability when the environment changed rapidly. As sea levels rose and lowlands vanished, not only were homes lost, but the social structures bound to them dissolved as well. Routes no longer existed to connect groups. Ritual grounds no longer appeared seasonally to reactivate memory. When the landscape disappeared, the natural system of memory storage vanished with it. Crucially, this disappearance does not reflect a lack of development. These societies did not fail because they were unintelligent or disorganized. They vanished because they were designed to live with a stable world, not to persist after that world slipped from its familiar position. Their way of life was optimized for open, flexible, water-rich environments. When those environments shrank and fragmented, their strengths became liabilities. Only societies that began separating memory from landscape through stone-fixed ritual spaces, centralized structures, were able to leave traces after the land was gone. And for this reason, the history we see today is not all of history, but the history of those ways of living fortunate enough to fit a changing world. Other ways of living, though they may have occupied most of humanity's time on Earth, flowed away with the water, leaving no voice in the official record. Thus, when we use the word civilization, we may be speaking more about preservation than about organization or intelligence. Post-glacial coastal societies lacked neither culture, nor structure, nor memory. They lacked only one thing we rely on today: to recognize the past, the ability to survive after the landscape itself disappeared. Once this is understood, the story of what was lost over 12,000 years of rising seas is no longer a story of lost civilizations, but a story of complete living worlds that once existed, then quietly unraveled when the foundations that carried memory were no longer there. For this reason, the question, how many, may not be the right question at all. A more fitting one might be, what kinds of worlds did we lose? Worlds of wide open corridors of movement. Worlds where memory was confirmed by footsteps. Worlds where people did not need stone to remember, because the land did that work for them. When those worlds sank, humans lost more than homes. They lost a way of remembering. What remains after the water is not a list of lost civilizations, but scattered signals, a stone tool hauled up in a fishing net, a flood story retold in a changed language, a structure like Göbekli Tepe, built not to live in, but to remember. These traces do not allow us to calculate, but they allow us to sense that the scale of loss exceeds anything that can be counted. This realization also forces us to look at history differently. History is not only the sequence of what lasted long enough to be recorded, it is also the sequence of what disappeared before it could become permanent. Over 12,000 years of rising seas, much of humanity's story unfolded in places now underwater. Not in the centers of continents, but at their edges. Not in places easy to preserve, but in places easily swept away. And perhaps what matters most is not how much we lost, but what we learn from the way it was lost. Ancient communities did not collapse because they failed to adapt. They collapsed in the sense that their world changed faster than any strategy could keep pace. What they left behind is not a lesson in failure, but a lesson in the limits of stability. Today, as we face another period of sea level rise, fast, uneven, and regional, the story of 12,000 years ago is no longer distant. It reminds us that what disappears first is not cities or monuments, but marginal worlds where memory is bound tightly to landscape. And when those landscapes vanish, memory must find new forms in order to survive. Perhaps that is why the question, how many did we lose, does not require a number, because the answer lies not in statistics, but in the recognition that a vast portion of human history once existed in places we are only beginning to learn how to look for, beneath the water, within myth, and inside the blank spaces on our maps. And as this journey closes, what remains is not obsession with what was lost, but a quieter understanding that humans have lived through changes far greater than those recorded by history, not by standing still, but by moving, remembering, and when necessary, learning how to remember without land beneath their feet. And as we bring this 12,000-year journey to a close, perhaps what lingers is not a number, not a list of lost civilizations, not a map of lands swallowed by the sea, but a very quiet realization. That much of human history once existed in places that no longer exist, along the edges of land, across low-lying plains, within spaces where memory once lived, alongside footsteps along coastlines, along the seasonal rise and fall of water. When the waters rose, those worlds did not collapse in any dramatic sense. They withdrew, little by little, across many generations, until no one remained who could remember exactly what they had once been like. What remains is not ruined cities, but absence. Absence on our maps, absence in archaeology, an absence in the way we tell the story of ourselves. Yet that absence is not completely silent. It whispers through myth. It surfaces in stone tools pulled up from the seabed. It stands quietly in places like Göbekli Tepe, where humans first learned how to remember when the ground itself was no longer reliable. Perhaps the most important thing this journey brings back to us is not sorrow, but humility. The understanding that the world we stand on has never been fixed. That what feels solid today has changed before and will change again. And that for most of human history, we did not endure by standing still, but by remembering, adapting, and continuing to tell our stories, even after the landscape itself had disappeared. If this story caused you to slow down, if it made you look at the world's map a little differently, leave a comment below. Tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? And if you would like to continue these quiet journeys into deep history, into myth, into worlds that existed before writing could preserve them, don't forget to follow the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the stories to come. Thank you for staying until the very end. Wishing you a peaceful night, and I hope the memory of those lost lands will drift with you just a little longer before sleep arrives.